I'm Micheal Elmgreen. I'm 49% of Elmgreen Dragset.
And I'm Ingar Dragset. I'm the other 49%.
Where's the last 2%?
It's that little monster in between us, the invisible.
It was not considered very noble to use storytelling in contemporary art. Of course, that triggered that we wanted to work with that. We sort of start storylines that the audience need to complete themselves. It's always fun to drive the less trafficked way. For at ændre vores lille skilt.
Og det er også nogen, der har lavet en lille graffiti på med sådan en smilefjes. Skal du se det?
Ja.
We're in front of our sculpture, Statue of Liberty.
It's an ATM machine embedded in an original piece from the Berlin Wall. We often work with displacement, placing objects in unusual locations or a location where this object was not supposed to be. It's a bit like when we do an upright swimming pool in Rockefeller Plaza, or we do a Prada store in the middle of desert in Texas. Here we have placed a piece of the Berlin Wall with a cast machine, two ready-mades combined to be a monument of the Berlin history. Therefore also the awkward title, Statue of Liberty.
What was the role of women, for instance, before the wall came down and after? You know, it was free childcare, for instance, in the East. Everybody were working. When the wall came down, that sort of wall collapsed. And it didn't immediately maybe become better just because you had access to Deutschmark or Western currency.
I don't really come from a family that would drag me to contemporary museums. But when I was in high school, I saw a Rothko painting for the first time. And I was quite astonished because the whole pattern and the colors of the painting was exactly the same as a long-haired carpet I had on the wall in my teenage room. I was sure he had ripped it off.
For me, literature was very important. I think I maybe read feminist literature at a too young age. I'm not sure I understood everything, but at the same time I was really, really fascinated. The women in New York, you know, casting their vaginas as part of a workshop, and I was completely fascinated by this as a child. And I didn't really, of course, get it, like what this was about fully in terms of like what happened in society, but still I think, you know, it gave me an idea of a big, exciting world out there. I think my next love was theater, and I also went to a theater high school that's specialized in, you know, in theater education. And that's how I ended up in Denmark.
And we went in a very unartistic space, a gay club in Copenhagen called After Dark. And we were the only one among the guests that had quite a grungy look. So we suddenly found out that we maybe should start to talk with each other. And we went to a bar and we found out that we actually lived in the same neighborhood, in the same street, and we actually lived in the same house.
So we had to go home together.
And then after a year, we found out that we were sharing so many things in our worldviews, in our ideas, our imaginations, that why not test out to do something together. I was invited to do a show in an alternative space in Stockholm, and I wanted to do some abstract knitted objects that people could cuddle with, you know. Sometimes in Stockholm it can be a bit stiff and people needed something to comfort them. And Ingar happened to be quite good in knitting. So when we went there, people were not really interacting with the objects. So we thought maybe we would show them how to interact with the objects. And we were sitting in each our corner, cuddling these knitted, abstract, small animals. And they thought it was a performance. So by coincidence, again, it became our first performance.
By doing these performances in art spaces, we realize how many conventions there are in these spaces, not only architecturally, but also in terms of rituals, how things are done. You know, the opening is always done on a certain date, within certain hours. And we were a bit surprised about how things are done routinely. We like now to sort of dress up the art space in drag, so to speak, becoming something else. One early example would be basically using the white cube, not doing much change to it, but putting 1 or 3 hospital beds in the space. This sort of antiseptic clinical atmosphere that you find in a hospital is also apparent in the gallery space.
We very soon realized that our critical approach to the white cube wouldn't really change the white cube. If it was going to change, at least in a temporary way, we had to do it ourselves. And therefore we wanted our art objects to be shown in a context that didn't look as rigid as a normal white cube does. We gave it a different kind of environment, and by that we actually have experienced that visitors are approaching our sculptural works in a complete different way. One aspect of our exhibition is that we want the audience to allow themselves to be uncertain to a certain degree, to be confused, because there's so much in our social media, in our news, that is so clarified, so simplified in today's world. So I think if there's something you're not completely sure about when you go to an exhibition, you might contemplate a bit more, you might reflect a bit slower upon what you actually see, what you experience, and maybe that link up to experiences you had yourself. Especially in times like this, it's important as an artist not being reduced to someone who just respond in a critical way to all the madness going on in the world, because then you can never reach a point that you find interesting yourself. You need to kind of downgrade your own debate level So it's important that you also keep a certain kind of integrity and reply with absolutely nonsense.
One historical artist that have kept reappearing in our work and in interviews is Hammershøi, a Danish interior painter. He painted his home mostly. Sometimes there's a figure. Most of the time it's his wife with the back to the viewer. We love his paintings because they are so charged with the psychology, even though they only show a space that's almost empty, some furniture, windows, and a lot of doors.
But even more than other artists, we are inspired by the history of filmmaking. Ingmar Bergman has been very important for many of our big installations. Directors are using space as an active storytelling factor in their films. How the space is part of making the cue for the film, or how they use the space as creating atmospheres.
Most of the childhood scenes that we depict are, childhood memories that we have talked about ourselves.
Very often we try to depict especially the masculine role in a different light. The idea of growing up as a boy in your childhood and the expectation that is put upon you. The more melancholic or sad, poetic side of our works have very much to do with all the shaming that is still happening in our world, and in recent time even more. And to be ambassadors for daring to have a more vulnerable, fragile position. Our installations or sculptures can maybe be read from queer angles, but I think it's too easy to label things like a sort of otherness. They're queer because we are, but there's so much else. If you're a heterosexual artist, no one will label you as a heterosexual artist, and that you deal with your identity as heterosexual in your work. But if you come from a different group, a more maybe marginalized group, you're always confronted with your identity and the presence of your identity in your work, which is of course something that is naturally there. On the table here we have a small sculpture called Dirty Socks, and that is actually inspired by the American photographer Peter Hudja, that was depicting a lot of scenes, sexual encounters on the piers in New York, very much also during the AIDS crisis in New York in the 80s. When you, as a young queer person, had to deal with the hardcore reality of the AIDS crisis at that time. It was, of course, linked to a lot of trauma, a lot of fear, that your first sexual experiences were linked to a certain degree of fear.
I guess we see the world a little bit like Samuel Beckett might have done. When you see a Beckett play, it's very dark, seemingly quite pessimistic, but also very, very funny sometimes. And we feel that Beckett is still, pretty relevant in today's society, if not even more than when he was, around and writing. The world is increasingly absurd, but I see no other chance really than, at least for yourself, trying to understand how it affects you, why it affects you, and through this process, hopefully give something to other people as well.
The humor in our life we describe as a sort of anger management. It comes out in that way instead of like fighting and screaming.